Welcome to Season 2 of the Cryptopulse podcast, your ultimate guide to the world of crypto, Bitcoin, and world economics. We're here to guide you through the crypto universe with thought-provoking topics, in-depth knowledge, and information to help you make informed decisions. We'll also be interviewing some of the best minds in the industry, such as CEOs of crypto projects, traders, economists, authors, and development teams from around the globe. And now for the episode.
Hello and welcome back to the Cryptopulse podcast for another one of our epic episodes about crypto and macroeconomics. This time we're going to be talking a little bit about El Salvador, which is an amazing follow-on conversation from our episode about the Lightning Network.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, nowhere has the Lightning Network been more prominent in the last 3 years than El Salvador for a number of different reasons. And I'm excited to talk about this one because El Salvador has been all over the news, very closely linked with Bitcoin and Bitcoin adoption. And I think it would be really interesting for us today to dive into the reasons why El Salvador have turned to Bitcoin and how it's all going for them now. All right, well, let's get into the history then. So, in 2001, El Salvador changed its legal currency to the US dollar, with the decision being both lauded and panned by local and foreign opinion. So, those for it praised lower interest rates and easier trade with other commercial partners, whilst those against it criticized it as a brash decision, pointing to a huge long-term inflation as prices were rounded upwards. So, the original currency, the colon, began to suffer because of its exchange rate to the dollar, and $1 US was equivalent to about 8.75 colones. This decreased the purchasing power of the population and slowed down El Salvador's exports. Remittances, as in the receiving money from family members outside the country, accounted for 23% of GDP in 2020, and economic policy was at the mercy of the US government. They controlled the flow of the US dollar in and out of the country.
23%. 23%.
It's huge, isn't it?
That's absolutely incredible. I've heard that statistic somewhere before, I think, but that's enormous.
Staggering for the overall GDP, right? Yeah. Well, with this all of this in mind, and knowing that 70% of the population at the time were unbanked, and El Salvador was and still is one of the poorest countries in Latin America, with an average annual income of $4,000 US, it makes a lot of sense why on June the 5th, 2021, President of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, announced by recorded video a bill to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender in El Salvador at the Bitcoin 21 conference in Miami. So Bukele claimed that the adoption of Bitcoin would make it easier for Salvadorians living abroad to send remittances to their relatives in the country, and the use of Bitcoin would also make digital transactions more accessible to the unbanked. So, on June the 9th of that year, the Legislative Assembly passed the Bitcoin law with a 73% majority vote and set aside $150 million in cash to back the country's Bitcoin. So, the government also announced that it would distribute $30 in Bitcoin to people who sign up to use the electronic wallet called Chivo, which is Salvadorian slang for cool, at a cost of up to $75 million. Now, a few months later, Bukele announced plan to build a circular Bitcoin city at the base of a volcano in the southeastern region of La Union. The plan was to take advantage of the volcanic geothermal energy to power Bitcoin mining. And in 2022, he also announced plans for the creation of $1 billion volcano bond, and these would be used to fund the Bitcoin city, as well as purchasing Bitcoin with a 5-year lockup period. And of course, this all sounds really amazing, but what was the reaction and consequences of these developments locally and worldwide?
Well, good question. And we're going to get onto one of my favorite topics over the last few weeks. Well, to start with, whenever plans were announced to make Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador, the World Bank, which is the institution tied closely to the IMF, insert evil sound. Thank you.
Haven't got the sound effect budget, sorry.
That provides developing and struggling countries with bonds, rejected a request from the government to assist with the implementation of the law due to transparency concerns and the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining, a topic that has been addressed dozens of times on the show. Currently, 60% of worldwide Bitcoin mining is run on renewable energy, which is a hell of a lot more than the government-backed fiat currency system.
Yes.
And I'm not going to even go into the other comments that they made there on this occasion. I think you can probably guess what we're thinking on that one. There were also a few protests in the capital city of San Salvador due to citizens opposing the use of tax dollars to purchase Bitcoin, as well as the limited rate of internet penetration in El Salvador, which would limit the number of people who could make use of Bitcoin. So many crypto advocates praised and encouraged further development of El Salvador, but it seemed that the country had a hurdle after hurdle to get through. This was not helped by the morally questionable decision of the IMF, who urged El Salvador to cease using Bitcoin as legal tender, citing its risks to the country's financial stability, integrity, and consumer protection, and the dangling risk of losing a previously discussed $1.3 billion loan. Problems started occurring with the volcano bonds, which faced delay after delay caused by a lack of investor interest. Now, legislative holdups and the current macro backdrop causing Bitcoin prices to fall, putting a strain on public funding as a whole. Locals want Bitcoin City to become a reality, but with all of these delays, they're starting to worry that the government won't be able to deliver what they promised. But the main theme from all locals is a sense of hope, even if things aren't rolling out as smooth as a lot of people would have liked. This experiment, as it were, is not over, but we should still look over the current rollout to see if we could glean any insights from this.
Yeah, it's whenever you have these periods of change, or when anybody is trying to innovate, do something differently, bring in some new energy, things often don't go as planned. You know, we see this time and time again. I actually really admire what they're trying to do in El Salvador, and I think Bukele has really got a great vision for the country. You know, this is currently a country that is at the mercy of the US dollar. They are, you know, very pressured at times by the IMF, and you know, for a country that has such an enormous percentage of its GDP attached to international remittance, there's a really strong case for them to try and adopt Bitcoin. And of course, Bitcoin at the moment is still going through this adoption phase, and so volatility is to be expected. And I know that when a lot of the news was announced by Bukele back last year and sort of into the start of 2022, Bitcoin price was riding high, and everyone was, you know, in that sort of mania and euphoria phase. And obviously, since then, we've been in a downward trend, and of course that doesn't really do much for sentiment, and especially for El Salvadorians. But I think with time, you know, I get the sense that he's probably on the right path.
I think so. I think this is an interesting experiment, and it is an experiment, and I'm a huge fan of it. And I don't think that it's sustainable for a country like Salvador to be using another country's currency that they're just really not in control of the supply. Just, you know, if anything, I think it's unethical for the population that live there. Let's just leave it at that. So, and I wish them every success with this. But let's look at macro backdrop a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the timing of the announcement has come at an interesting time in global economics, to put it lightly. So, although from an independent standpoint, trying to step away from the dollar and the US government controlling economic policy, the struggle for total mainstream adoption of Bitcoin in the country has really been difficult. So, from education and digital literacy problems, the Salvadorian Chamber of Commerce found that only 14% of businesses in El Salvador had had conducted Bitcoin transactions between September 21 and July 22. And this means that the US dollar is still the most used currency in the country. And whilst this can be fixed with more education and public funding, the current Fed interest rate hikes and the drop in crypto prices and traditional El Salvador bonds decreasing, the current timing of the implementation is really just not ideal.
Yes. Yeah, I can see that. It's not ideal.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting point about digital literacy, because it's something that my mind has skipped over. It is like, well, if you implemented that in the UK, for example, 80% of people would be like, yeah, okay, I can use the wallet, and I might not understand what it is, but I've used internet banking before. But if you haven't got readily available internet connection and a digitally literate economy, then this type of adoption is going to be slow, and there is going to be some pushback because people don't like change, and if they don't really quite understand this, they're going to be a bit fearful.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course the education piece will take time, and it will cost money, and I wonder whether that's really been factored into Bukele's plans. Of course, digital literacy is one thing, but access to smart devices, which will, give them the access to the Chivo app and other Lightning Network products is another thing. But as we say, with all things, these things do take time. I think it'd be cool just to finally touch upon the IMF, which I know is those lot, which I know is just your favourite bunch, and their feelings on all of this.
Okay, sure. So the IMF's comments on El Salvador were, as Greg Foss put it when we chatted to him, quite frankly, dangerous. Although their current goals are to reduce poverty and achieve sustainable growth, their current actions when it comes to developing countries make it seem that they don't want developing countries to become, well, let's just say developed, because then they wouldn't need the IMF anymore, would they now?
They wouldn't.
Although their creation in 1944 was to rebuild Europe's economic structure after World War II, once the Soviet Union collapsed, they seem to have morphed into a vessel that reframed struggling countries to a globalist mindset for greater economic extraction. But what El Salvador is trying to do, I think, really scares the IMF, and it's quite difficult to gatekeep. And CoinDesk journalist David Morris puts it into perspective really quite well. So I'll just read some of this that he's written. So at the highest level, the IMF's reason for existence is not to boost developing economies or help the individuals who live within them. The IMF is not a neutral aid organization, but an economic arm of a vast power structure that frequently hides itself from behind the language of uplift and reform. It seeks to draw peripheral or developing nations, African and Latin American countries being a current high priority, into the post-war neoliberal consensus. Crypto threatens that power, even if the threat is somewhat distant for now. But as El Salvador is attempting to demonstrate, cryptocurrency is not easy to gatekeep. It seems very plausible that smaller nations such as El Salvador will before long have access to a parallel crypto-based debt and financing market over which the Western order has only a tenuous influence.
Yeah, good words.
Very good words.
I would strongly recommend to anybody that's interested in the inner workings of the IMF to read a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It was written by John Perkins and published in 2004. And it's the sort of biopic of a guy that goes out and starts off with the Peace Corps and eventually finds himself negotiating these types of deals with developing countries and creating a debt-based system where actually, they know that these countries can't repay the loans. And not only can they not repay the loans, the money that they've been loaned has got to be spent on specific infrastructure, which has to be facilitated by American companies. So yeah, it's a very good one. Whether you believe every word of it, I don't know, but it's certainly an interesting perspective.
I think it's essential reading for anybody that's keen to learn more about Bitcoin. I do sound like a broken record sometimes, so I apologize if you listen to every episode. But if you're newer to the show, I honestly think that you can't understand Bitcoin if you don't understand the problem it's trying to solve. And I think that this book, and I think there's an updated version, Ben. I think there's a slightly newer version called The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And maybe we could even get the author on the show at some point. That would be really interesting to talk to him about his perspective on things and how things are changing and how Bitcoin fits or doesn't fit into his thinking.
Yeah, he's written a lot of really great books, actually. So the latest was, well, you're right, I think he rewrote, and there's The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, but he also released in 2007 The Secret History of the American Empire, which is a bit of an expose of international corruption and what he thinks that people can do about it. But yeah, it's a really fascinating perspective. And just to echo what you said, you can't really understand Bitcoin unless you understand the history of money and how money is woven into the fabric of society. So we'll pop the links in the show note for anyone that is more intrigued.
Definitely. So I wonder which other countries are going to look at what El Salvador are doing and attempt to do the same. And I wonder if they'll actually manage to get this thing off the ground. I do believe they can. I think it's essential. I think it's essential that this model can be proven to be successful, even if it's moderately successful. I think with all of this innovation and change, when you're trying to replace something that isn't serving the population that well with something else, you can always have unintended consequences and things that you don't see, because I don't think that there's any such thing as a utopia. And if you try and aim to that, it can be quite dangerous. So I think that there's going to be certainly challenges along the way, but you've got to applaud what they're doing in El Salvador. And I would really like to visit one day and actually understand exactly what's going on there and see it from my own perspective and ask people a few questions.
Yeah, it's certainly innovative, and I think innovation takes time, and this has never been done before. On your question about which nations are going to potentially adopt this strategy in future, we've talked on the show about members of the G20 now with their local currencies really, really struggling. Turkey is a great example. I think the Turkish lira has lost 85 to 95% of its value against the dollar in the last decade, and they went through a period of staggering inflation just last year. And countries like that are now relying on the dollar for international trade, and there are some pros to that, of course. But for nations that want to have sovereignty over their monetary supply, Bitcoin does make sense. But of course, it really all depends on who's in power at the time and their sort of attitude to decentralization and uncoupling money from governments.
You're right.
Which, of course,
I was thinking exactly the same thing, because ultimately it comes down to this: is that are the government okay with doing that? Do they believe that that's gonna be a good thing? And I don't think that there's any chance in Western democracies that we're going to see that happening anytime soon, particularly.
No, I agree. There's no incentive for governments to uncouple themselves from the monetary system, but it should happen. It should, just as governments uncoupled themselves from church, and religion nearly sort of 50, 60 years ago. I think it's an important step, because governments have no business in people's money, the same way as they have no business in people's religions or how they run their lives. So, governments are here to govern. And I think, unfortunately, they've taken umbrage over the last few years to really take more power than should be granted to them. So I would love to see a world where that separation happens. But it's, that domino effect, isn't it? And I think it's a small start in El Salvador, and let's see where it leads.
We are seeing other countries in Africa looking at a similar thing. And so let's see where this takes us. But the US dollar can't be the world reserve currency forever. There's just too many problems with that. And you mentioned Turkey, you also Argentina, and these are big economies. Like, if you look at the amount of manufacturing, export and import that's in Turkey, it's enormous. It's a gateway country between, Asia and Europe as well. So
It is.
And for them to be in this situation is, well, I mean, I don't know too much about Turkish politics and decision making, but if you've got a successful business there, or your family, or you've got a job there, and you'll be paid in lira, in Turkish lira, and then all of a sudden, your food is like 3 or 4 times more expensive. That's completely unfair. So Bitcoin does fix a lot of these problems. So we've got a long way to go, and we love talking about this stuff because I think the crypto community can always very much be looking at the next coin that's going to moon. But if you actually understand what the purpose of Bitcoin is and what it can do for developing nations, then by spreading this word, we can do it our little bit to see mainstream adoption, which will help everybody.
Yeah, gosh, we are starting to sound like Bitcoin maxis, aren't we? I promise you, we do like some of the other cryptos, and there are lots of very exciting things going on in this ecosystem. But I think I've said to you privately that over the last year or so, my understanding of Bitcoin has deepened, and its purpose is much more profound now than it ever has been. It's needed much more than it ever was. So
I also think we're like, when we started doing this show at the end of 2017, gosh, it was that long ago now, and you'd bought Bitcoin before me, and you knew more about it before me. But when I was very, very new into this space, we were both in different personal situations as well. I think financially, business wise, and being new into the market, you're always looking for those cryptos that can have the higher upside. But ultimately, if I'm buying Bitcoin now and I'm putting it on a hardware wallet, I know in 10 years it's going to still exist. And you look at,
of course,
99% of the other cryptos, and are they going to be around or not? Are they going to fork? Do I have to do something? Do I have to put it on an exchange and do a token swap or whatever it is? And I think that if you're looking at building long-term wealth over sensible time horizon, rather than the sort of 6 to 12 months mentality that many crypto investors have, then Bitcoin is the obvious answer. And it's not to say that some of these other layer ones and blockchain projects and Web3 projects aren't excellent. I think they are. And we've spoken about on a recent episode about where we think the economy is going to go in respect of things like the metaverse and, Web3 and decentralized computing. That's going to be enormous. And there's some incredible projects being built there. But to me, that's it sort of tastes the same as some kind of tech equity, where you're thinking, well, this is going to be around a long while, and I'm going to buy in now, and it's going to go up in value because more people are going to use the network. But you never quite know what's going to happen with those, because they all have, generally speaking, a CEO or somebody steering it, whether they're a foundation or not. You still have a Vitalik, for example. And what's been going on with like the Ethereum merge is I think it's really exciting. It'll do a lot of good for the space, but nothing's as decentralized as Bitcoin. And if you really are a decentralized purist, then you start to become a bit of a Bitcoin maxi. So I'm very much a maxi, but I'm not anti. I think there's room for everything, but ultimately I think people's aim who are Bitcoin maxis are to accumulate more Bitcoin. Otherwise, whether that's just dollar cost averaging in, or whether it's buying other cryptos that they will then switch into BTC afterwards. So that's my thoughts on things.
Quality strategy. Well, yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it for today's episode. I think it's been really useful to talk through some of this stuff, and it's one that we've wanted to do for a little while.
Yeah.
We're going to do a few more of these, I think, where we sort of, at the moment we are in a bear market, and the market hype has sort of disappeared for now. I think we keep saying the tourists have left, and for us, these are the episodes that we enjoy doing. We're sort of deep diving into specific topics and sort of particular people. So yeah, do let us know if you're enjoying them.
Yeah, we love doing these. I think with some of the weekly roundup shows we've done, we've touched on topics, but when there's so much going on in the market sometimes, we wanted to cram in as much information as possible. But we're finding that these types of episodes are way more popular and we're getting better feedback than just sort of going through the weekly news, because a lot of the weekly news hasn't been enormously positive. And whilst we don't mind talking about the negative stuff, we don't want to bring you negative news every single week. So
not every day.
If there's any topics you want us to discuss, find us on Twitter at crypto_pulse. And if you're new to the show, thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Ciao.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. It would mean the world to us if you could leave a review wherever you're listening. This really does help and allows other people to find us online. You can keep up to date with new releases of the podcast by subscribing and following us on Twitter or Instagram for the latest crypto-related news. Information provided by Cryptopulse via this podcast, website, social media channels, and any other medium does not constitute financial advice, investment recommendations, or any other type of advice whatsoever. The Cryptopulse team are not professional financial advisors. Trading and purchasing cryptocurrencies do carry risks, and anybody wishing to partake in such activities should seek professional advice.